Out on the Kansas prairie, some storms you can see coming for miles. A darkness on the horizon, a change in the air. You have time to find shelter, to tie down what's loose. But other storms, they don't look like storms at all. They look like a house. They look like a light in the window. They look like a kind old woman with a smile that never ever reaches her eyes. This is a story about that kind of storm. Clara Morrison felt the cold deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the rain. Her horse, Buttercup, was done. Every step was a stumble, every breath a ragged gasp. The wind was a physical thing, a monster trying to rip her from the saddle. For hours there had been nothing but an endless, whipping sea of grass. And then she saw it, a house, 2 stories, white paint peeling in the twilight, standing alone against the fury of the storm like a stubborn ghost. A single light glowed in a downstairs window, a tiny pinprick of hope in a world that had run out of it. Smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth, of safety. As she got closer, a wooden sign came into view, swinging wildly on its hinges. The faded letters spelled out a welcome. Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house, hospitality and shelter for weary travelers. Relief hit Clara so hard it almost knocked the wind out of her. A boarding house, a respectable place. Run by a widow most likely, safe, clean. A place for a woman traveling alone to rest without fear. She'd heard of them, these little islands of civilization on the frontier. But there was something about this one. Something wrong. The house was too perfect, too isolated. There were no other buildings for miles, no farm, no well-trod road leading to it. It was as if it had simply been dropped from the sky. Still, a roof was a roof, and the stable next to the main house looked sturdy enough. She guided the exhausted Buttercup toward it. The stable door was banging open and shut in the wind, a frantic, rhythmic slam. Inside it was dark and smelled of hay and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. Clara dismissed it. A farm animal, probably. 3 other horses stood in their stalls. They were beautiful animals, well-fed, their coats gleaming even in the dim light. But they were unnervingly still. They didn't nicker a welcome or shift their weight. They just stood there, staring at the far wall, as if they were listening for something Clara couldn't hear. She unsaddled Buttercup, her fingers numb and clumsy. She found fresh hay, filled a bucket with water, and rubbed the mare down as best she could. "Rest easy, girl," she whispered. "We're safe now." But as the words left her mouth, she didn't believe them. She grabbed her saddlebags and her rifle, took a deep breath, and ran through the downpour to the front porch. The porch boards groaned under her weight. She stood at the front door for a moment, suddenly self-conscious. She was caked in mud, her hair was a mess, and she smelled like a wet horse. But a boarding house on the prairie had surely seen worse. She knocked. The door opened instantly, so instantly it was clear someone had been standing right behind it, waiting. The woman in the doorway was a pillar of black, silk, and gray. Severe hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She was maybe 50, with a face that had once been handsome, but was now a roadmap of prairie hardship. Her dress was old-fashioned, the kind a widow wears for years after her husband is gone. But it was her eyes that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. They were the palest blue she had ever seen, the color of ice on a frozen lake, and they looked at Clara not with welcome, but with appraisal, like a butcher sizing up a prize hog. "Another traveler caught in God's fury," the woman said. Her voice was surprisingly soft, with an odd lilting quality. "Come in, child, before you catch your death." Clara stepped inside, and the warmth of the house wrapped around her like a blanket. It smelled of beef stew and baking bread, and her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was painful. This was what she'd been dreaming of, so why did the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end? "Thank you, ma'am," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Clara Morrison, on my way to Dodge City. The storm, it caught me unprepared." "Storms have a way of doing that," the woman said. She closed the heavy oak door behind Clara and turned the lock. The sound was loud, final. "I'm Mrs. Magnolia Whitmore. This is my establishment." Her icy eyes scanned Clara from head to toe, lingering on the colt, .45 strapped to her hip, then on the rifle in her hand. "You'll be wanting a hot meal and a warm bed, I expect." "Yes, ma'am. I can pay." Mrs. Whitmore waved a dismissive hand. "We'll discuss payment after you've eaten. Can't have you dripping all over my clean floors. Follow me." She led Clara down a long hallway. The walls were covered in faded photographs in ornate frames. Stern-faced men and women stared out, their eyes all sharing the same hollow, haunted look. The house was much larger inside than it looked, with corridors branching off in every direction. It was spotless, but everything was worn, threadbare, like gentility clinging on by a thread. They entered a large dining room. A long oak table dominated the space, set for a dozen guests, though only 3 places were occupied. 3 men sat eating in a silence so profound it was almost a sound in itself. They looked up when Clara entered, and that's when the feeling of wrongness solidified into something sharp and cold in her gut. They were all dressed impeccably, far too well for travelers on the Kansas plains. One man in his 40s wore a city suit. Another, younger, sported a silk cravat and a brocade vest. The third, barely a man at all, had a gold watch chain gleaming across his stomach. But it wasn't their clothes. It was their faces. They all had the exact same expression, a blank, vacant stare. The look of men who had seen something so terrible it had scooped out everything inside them, leaving only an empty shell. They looked at Clara with a strange mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher. Was it hope? Fear? Or was it a warning? "Gentlemen," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice smooth as cream, "this is Miss Morrison. She'll be joining us this evening." The 3 men nodded, all at once, a single synchronized movement that was deeply, deeply unnatural. Then they went back to their food, lifting their forks to their mouths with the jerky, mechanical motions of puppets. "Sit here, child," Mrs. Whitmore said, pointing to a chair at the far end of the table. "I'll bring you something hot." She swept out of the room through a swinging door, leaving Clara alone with the 3 silent men. The only sounds were the storm raging outside and the soft, rhythmic clink of silverware against china. It was the loneliest sound Clara had ever heard. She took off her wet hat and tried to smooth her hair. The silence was pressing in on her, suffocating her. She had to break it. "Evening," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. The youngest man, the one with the watch chain, looked up. He opened his mouth as if to speak, a flicker of something desperate in his eyes. But the man in the middle, the one with the beard, kicked him sharply under the table. The young man flinched and immediately looked down at his plate. What in God's name was going on here? Mrs. Whitmore returned with a tray. She placed a steaming bowl of stew, a thick slice of cornbread, and a mug of black coffee in front of Clara. The smell was heavenly. All her fears seemed to melt away in the face of such simple, honest food. "Eat up," Mrs. Whitmore said, taking a seat at the head of the table. She didn't have a plate herself. She just sat there, her hands folded, her pale eyes fixed on Clara's face. "You'll need your strength." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She devoured the meal, her hunger overriding her unease. The stew was rich, the cornbread was sweet, and the coffee was hot and strong. It was the best meal she'd had in weeks. But as she ate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not just by Mrs. Whitmore, but by the 3 silent men. They had finished their own meals but hadn't moved. They just sat there, hands in their laps, staring. Not at her, but through her. "You're traveling alone," Mrs. Whitmore said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. My aunt in Dodge City is sick. I'm her only family." "Dangerous for a woman alone," Mrs. Whitmore mused. "All sorts of perils on the prairie." Clara instinctively touched the butt of her Colt. "I can take care of myself." A smile played on Mrs. Whitmore's lips, but it was a cold, thin thing. "I'm sure you can, child. Still, the storm is a blessing in disguise. You're safe here tonight." Something in the way she said the word safe made Clara's skin crawl. It didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a threat. She glanced at the 3 men again. They looked like statues. Safe from what? "Your other guests," Clara said, choosing her words carefully, "are they traveling far?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile widened. "Oh, they're not traveling anymore. They're staying here." Indefinitely. Isn't that right, gentlemen? And then they did it again. The three men nodded in perfect, eerie unison. Not a word, just the nod. This wasn't a boarding house. Clara knew it with a certainty that chilled her more than the rain ever could. This was something else entirely. Mrs. Whitmore stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor. Now then, Miss Morrison, about your accommodation for the night. She walked toward a dark corner of the room, a corner so deep in shadow Clara hadn't even noticed it before. I have a particular way of running my establishment. A rule, you might say. A rule that all my female guests must follow. Clara heard a sound from the corner, a faint metallic rattle, the sound of a chain. Her hand went to her gun. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Mrs. Whitmore stepped aside, revealing what had been hidden in the shadows. And Clara Morrison's world tilted on its axis. It was a man. No, a warrior. An Apache warrior, by the look of him. He was huge, built like a buffalo, with shoulders that strained the seams of his torn leather shirt. His hair was long and black, falling around a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was covered in scars, old and new, and he was in chains. Heavy iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles. A thick chain ran from the shackles to a massive iron ring bolted directly into the floorboards. He wasn't a guest. He was a prisoner. But it was his eyes that held Clara captive. They were dark, fierce, and burning with a rage so pure it was terrifying. He was defeated, but he was not broken. When he looked at Clara, she saw a sharp, blazing intelligence. And in that intelligence, she saw the same thing she'd seen in the eyes of the other men. A warning. "This is another one of my permanent guests," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice light and conversational, as if she were showing off a piece of furniture. "A savage I've been attempting to civilize. I've had no success yet, I'm afraid, but I am a very patient woman." "You keep a man chained like an animal," Clara whispered, horrified. "Oh, he is an animal, I assure you. Quite dangerous. Killed 3 men before he was captured. The territorial marshal was going to hang him, but I intervened. I believe everyone deserves a chance at redemption, don't you?" The Apache's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. His burning eyes never left Clara. Mrs. Whitmore walked back to the table, her black skirts rustling. "Now about my rule." She paused for effect, letting the tension in the room build until it was almost unbearable. "You see, I provide more than just food and shelter here. I provide companionship. A woman alone needs protection in these uncertain times. It's a dangerous world out there, Miss Morrison." She gestured with one elegant hand, a gesture that encompassed the 3 silent men at the table and the chained warrior in the corner. "So for your own safety, of course, I insist that all my female guests choose a companion for the night." She smiled that terrible, icy smile again. "Pick one," she said. "He's yours until morning." The world stopped. The storm outside, the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, the frantic beat of her own heart. It all went silent. Clara stared at the 4 men, the 3 broken dolls at the table, the caged wolf in the corner. This wasn't hospitality. This was a nightmare. A twisted, insane game where she didn't know the rules, but she knew, with every fiber of her being, that there was no way to win. Her hand tightened on the grip of her Colt. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile never wavered, but a flicker of something hard and cold sparked in her pale eyes. "Oh, don't look so shocked, child. It's a perfectly simple arrangement. You choose one of these gentlemen to share your room. For protection, as I said. The prairie is full of dangers, drifters, outlaws, savages. A woman alone is vulnerable." "I can protect myself," Clara said, her voice a low growl. "I just need a room. I'll pay double the rate if privacy is extra." At the table, the 3 men shifted nervously. The youngest one, Robert, started to speak again. But the bearded man, James, shot him a look so sharp it could have cut glass. "I'm afraid that's not how my establishment operates," Mrs. Whitmore said. She took a step closer, and Clara caught a strange, sweet, medicinal scent clinging to her clothes. Laudanum, maybe, or something stronger. House rules are house rules. You either choose a companion, or you brave the storm. She let the threat hang in the air, thick and heavy. The nearest town is 20 miles. In this weather, the wind howled, rattling the window panes as if to punctuate her point. Clara knew Buttercup couldn't make another mile, let alone 20. She was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. "This is insane," Clara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "You can't force me to—" "Force?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "My dear child, I'm not forcing anything. I'm simply explaining the terms of my hospitality. You are free to leave anytime you wish." A lie. The heavy lock on the front door, the isolation, the raging storm, it was all a cage, just as real as the chains on the Apache. Clara looked at the three men again. Their empty eyes stared back, but now she saw something else stirring in the depths. The bearded man James caught her gaze and held it. His lips moved, forming a single, silent word she couldn't quite make out. It looked like run, but that was impossible. "These gentlemen," Clara said, stalling for time, her mind racing. "Their guests here?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Whitmore said brightly. She pointed to the older man with thinning hair. "That is Mr. Theodore Blackwood, a businessman from Chicago. Lost his way in the storm some months ago." She indicated the bearded man. "Mr. James Henley, a cattle dealer from Texas, a fine, upstanding man." Finally, she pointed to the young one. "And that is Mr. Robert Crane, studying to be a physician. All respectable men who appreciate the unique services I provide." None of the men reacted. They sat like statues in a wax museum, their faces frozen masks of polite indifference. Clara's gaze drifted back to the Apache in the corner. Up close, she could see the proud, defiant set of his jaw, the raw, chafed skin on his wrists where the chains had rubbed them bloody, the sheer, untamed power in his muscles. He was a force of nature, held in check only by iron. "And him?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore's smile turned cruel. "Oh, surely you wouldn't consider that choice. He's a savage, a killer. I keep him as a reminder. A reminder of what happens to those who refuse to be civilized." "Does he have a name?" "They called him Joseph at the reservation school, though I doubt he answers to it. The Apache have their own heathen names, unpronounceable things. He hasn't spoken a single word since I acquired him." Clara studied the chained man. He held himself with a dignity that seemed impossible given his circumstances. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not the mindless animal Mrs. Whitmore described, but a man who had been pushed to the absolute limit and had not yet broken. He was more alive than the other three put together. "How long have they all been here?" Clara asked. "Oh, time passes differently on the prairie," Mrs. Whitmore said with a breezy wave of her hand. "Days blend into weeks, weeks into months. My gentlemen guests come and go as they please." Another lie, smooth as silk and just as suffocating. "Now," Mrs. Whitmore said, her tone hardening, "you must be tired. Make your choice, Miss Morrison, so we can get you settled for the night." Every instinct screamed at Clara to run, to draw her gun and fight her way out. But she was one woman against, what? An old lady, three broken men, and one chained warrior? No, there was more to it. The farm hands Henley had mentioned in the original story. The sheer confidence of this woman. Trying to fight now would be suicide. She had to play the game, at least until she understood the rules. "If I must choose," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I need to know more about my options. May I speak with them?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion in their icy depths. But then she smiled. "Of course. How prudent of you. Gentlemen, Miss Morrison would like to converse. Do try to make yourselves agreeable." Clara walked slowly toward the table, feeling like she was approaching a cage of sleeping tigers. She stopped in front of Theodore Blackwood, the businessman. Up close, she could see that the fine fabric of his suit was worn thin at the elbows and cuffs, with small, careful stitches repairing tears. He'd been wearing this suit for a very, very long time. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said gently, "how long have you been staying here?" His mouth worked for a moment, but no sound came out. He looked at Mrs. Whitmore, a quick, terrified glance, then back at his plate. I, the railroad, he finally managed, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. I was going to San Francisco. Business. His words trailed off, his eyes losing focus, as if he'd forgotten the rest of the story. Clara moved to the next man, James Henley. Before she could speak, he shot his hand out and gripped her wrist. His touch was ice cold, his grip surprisingly strong, desperate. Choose carefully, he whispered, his voice urgent and raw. His eyes bored into hers, trying to communicate a world of warning in a single glance. Some choices are safer than others. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat, a sharp, cutting sound. Henley snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his face going pale. Clara backed away, her heart pounding. She turned to the youngest, Robert Crane. He wouldn't even look at her. He just stared at his empty plate, a single muscle jumping in his jaw. I wanted to help people, he mumbled, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. I was going to be a doctor. I had books, instruments. I wanted to help people. It was the saddest thing she had ever heard. These weren't guests. They were ghosts, prisoners held by chains she couldn't see, their spirits broken, their futures stolen. She turned away from the table, away from the three hollow men, and walked toward the corner, toward the one man who still seemed to have a fire burning inside him. Mrs. Whitmore made a disapproving sound, a soft hiss like a snake, but didn't stop her. The Apache warrior watched her approach, his body tensing, the muscles in his powerful shoulders bunching. He was ready for a fight, even in chains. This close, Clara could smell the sweat and dirt in defiance on him. His dark eyes were filled with a fierce, unbroken pride. He was not a victim. He was a captive. There was a world of difference. I'm sorry, Clara said, her voice soft. No one should be kept like this. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe. A flicker of something that wasn't pure rage. His lips parted slightly as if he might speak. But then his gaze flicked past her, to Mrs. Whitmore, and his mouth snapped shut, his expression hardening back into a granite mask. Touching, but pointless, Mrs. Whitmore said from across the room. He's beyond redemption, I'm afraid. Now, Miss Morrison, I really must insist. The hour grows late. Clara turned to face her tormentor. What happens after I choose? Why, you'll be escorted to your comfortable room, where you can rest safely until morning. Your chosen companion will ensure no harm comes to you during the night. Her smile was a mockery. In the morning, after a hearty breakfast, you'll be free to continue on your journey. Lie after lie after lie, and if I refuse, the smile vanished completely. Then you will leave my house immediately. You will go back out into the storm, and I will be forced to report to the territorial marshal that a woman matching your description was seen in the company of known outlaws. Such reports can make travel difficult, especially for a woman alone. The threat was clear as glass. She wouldn't just be left to the storm, she'd be hunted. Clara felt the walls of the trap closing in. She looked around the room, at the broken men, their faces a canvas of quiet desperation. At the chained warrior, his eyes burning a hole in the shadows. At the windows, black with rain and fury. She needed to think. She walked to the window, turning her back on the room, pretending to watch the storm. Her mind was a whirlwind. She could choose one of the three men. They seemed harmless, broken. But Henley's warning, some choices are safer than others. What did that mean? Choosing one of them might be a trap in itself. Were they meant to harm her? Or was there another purpose to this sick game? Or she could choose the Apache. Mrs. Whitmore clearly didn't want her to. She called him a savage, an animal. She was trying to steer Clara away from him, and that made him the most interesting choice of all. He was the only one who wasn't broken, the only one with fight left in him. He was a risk, a massive, unpredictable risk. But in a house where safety was an illusion, maybe the biggest risk was the only real choice. She turned back around. Every eye in the room was on her. Theodore, James, and Robert watched her with a terrible, pleading hunger in their eyes. The Apache watched her with a steady, unreadable intensity. And Mrs. Whitmore stood like a spider in the center of her web, waiting to see which strand would tremble. I've made my decision, Clara announced, her voice ringing with a confidence she didn't feel. Excellent, Mrs. Whitmore chirped, clasping her hands together. And which gentleman will have the honor of protecting you tonight? Clara took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. They could be her salvation, or they could be her death sentence. The storm howled, and somewhere deep in the house, she heard a floorboard creak upstairs. They weren't alone. There were others here. Other secrets hidden in the shadows of this terrible place. She had to choose. But every instinct told her that in this house of secrets and chains, no choice was truly safe. She met the chain warrior's gaze across the room. She saw the defiance there, the raw will to survive. It was a mirror of her own. The other men were victims. This one was a fighter. And tonight, Clara Morrison needed a fighter. I choose him, she said, pointing directly at the Apache warrior. The silence that followed was absolute. The three men at the table stared, their mouths agape. It was a choice they had clearly never considered possible. James Henley looked almost relieved. Theodore Blackwood just looked confused, as if the rules of his prison had suddenly been rewritten. But it was Mrs. Whitmore's reaction that was the most telling. For the first time, her mask of polite control slipped. Just for a second, a flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed her face. Her pale eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into slits of ice. She had not expected this. This was not part of her game. Then just as quickly, the mask was back in place. She let out a small, tinkling laugh, a sound completely devoid of humor. My dear Miss Morrison, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Are you quite sure? He's a filthy savage. He hasn't bathed in weeks. He's dangerous. I can't be held responsible for what he might do to you. You offered me a choice for my protection, Clara said, her voice cold and steady. And he looks like the strongest man in this room. If the prairie is as dangerous as you say, then I want the best protection I can get. She had turned the woman's own logic against her, and it was clear Mrs. Whitmore did not like it. A bold choice, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice tight. A very foolish choice, but a choice is a choice. House rules, after all. She walked over to a small cabinet on the wall, unlocked it with a key from her pocket, and took out a large, heavy iron key. It was clear she hated doing this. Every movement was stiff with anger. Very well, she said, her voice practically a hiss. James, you will escort Miss Morrison and her companion to room 4, the one at the end of the West Hall. James Henley jumped to his feet, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Was it fear for her, or something else? Mrs. Whitmore strode over to the Apache, holding the key out of his reach. You will behave yourself, she said to him, as if speaking to a dog. You will not harm her. You will not try to escape. If you do, the consequences will be severe for both of you. Do you understand? The Apache warrior just stared at her, his expression unyielding. He didn't nod. He didn't give her the satisfaction. With a sigh of frustration, Mrs. Whitmore knelt and unlocked the chain from the iron ring in the floor. The sound of the lock clicking open was like a gunshot in the silent room. She left the shackles on his wrists and ankles, but now a 10-foot length of heavy chain trailed behind him. He was mobile, but still a prisoner. He rose to his feet slowly, majestically. He towered over everyone in the room, a giant of a man, his presence filling the space. He looked at Clara, a long, searching look. There was no gratitude in his eyes, but there was a deep, burning curiosity. He was trying to figure out her game, just as she was trying to figure out his. This way, Miss Morrison, James Henley said, his voice strained. He wouldn't look at Clara or at the Apache. He just stared at the doorway, desperate to leave the room. Clara fell into step behind him, and the Apache followed her, the chain dragging and scraping on the wooden floor with every step. The sound was a constant, chilling reminder of their situation. As they left, Clara glanced back. Mrs. Whitmore stood by the table, her face a thundercloud. The other two men, Theodore and Robert, were watching them go with expressions of pure terror. They weren't afraid of the Apache. They were afraid for her. What had she just done? The hallway was a maze of shadows and secrets. Oil lamps cast long, dancing shapes on the walls. making the portraits of the dead seem to watch them pass. James Henley walked quickly, his shoulders hunched. "Room 4, he whispered without turning around, "is not a guest room." "What is it?" Clara whispered back, her heart starting to pound again. "It's for punishment. There are no windows. The door locks from the outside. She's not giving you a room for the night, Miss Morrison. She's putting you in a cell." They reached the end of a long, dark corridor. Door number 4 was made of heavy, reinforced wood, with a small sliding peephole at eye level. It looked like a prison door. James pulled a key from his pocket and fumbled with the lock. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his hands shaking. "I have to do this. She's always watching, always listening." He got the door open and stepped back, ushering them inside. The room was just as he'd described. Small, bare, and cold. A single, thin mattress lay on the floor. A bucket stood in the corner. That was it. The air was stale and smelled of despair. Clara and the Apache stepped inside. He moved to the far corner, the chain rattling, and sat with his back to the wall, a silent, watchful giant. James Henley looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. "You made a mistake," he breathed. "A terrible mistake." "Why?" Clara asked. "What's so special about him?" "He's the only one she can't break," James whispered frantically. "The rest of us, she uses drugs, in the food, the water. Things that make you compliant, that fog your memory, that steal your will. We're addicts, Miss Morrison, addicted to our own damn prison. But him, the drugs don't work on him. They just make him sick or angry. He's pure, unconquered, and she hates him for it." He pressed something small and folded into Clara's hand. "She'll leave you in here for a day, maybe 2, to teach you a lesson. When you're hungry and thirsty and terrified, she'll come and offer you a deal. Don't take it. Whatever you do, don't take it." "What is this?" Clara asked, looking down at the folded paper in her hand. "It's a map of the house. Theodore drew it from memory. It shows the secret passages. The walls are hollow. That's how she moves around, how she listens. There's a way out through the old cellar, but the door is always bolted." He glanced over his shoulder, terrified. "I have to go. She'll know I've been talking too long." "Wait," Clara said. "The other men, Theodore and Robert, why did they want me to choose them?" A look of profound sadness crossed James's face. "Because the rule is real. When a woman chooses one of us, we get a reprieve. Better food, less of the drug for a few days, a taste of what it was like to be human again. And there's a hope, a foolish hope, that maybe, just maybe, this new woman will be the one to save us." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "But it never works out. The women who choose us, they disappear. We find their things gone a few days later. Mrs. Whitmore tells us they left in the night. But we know they end up in the garden." "The garden? There are stones in the north corner, unmarked. Don't let her put you there, Miss Morrison. Don't let her—" His voice broke. Before Clara could say another word, he pulled the heavy door shut. The peephole slid open, and she saw his terrified eye for a second. Then it was gone. The heavy bolt slammed home on the outside. The sound echoed in the small dark room. Clara was locked in, alone in the dark with a chained killer, in a house of horrors run by a monster. She had made her choice, and now she was going to have to live with it, or die from it. The darkness in the room was absolute. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, listening to James's footsteps fade away down the hall. The silence he left behind was heavier, more menacing than any sound. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but there was no light to be found. No window, no crack under the door. It was like being buried alive. Then from the corner came the soft, metallic scrape of a chain on stone. He was there, the Apache, her chosen protector, her cellmate, her heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Whitmore had called him a killer, a savage. James had said he was the only one the old woman couldn't break. Which was true. Was he a monster, or was he a victim? Or was he something else entirely? "Hello," she said, her voice a dry whisper. It was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No response. Just the slow, rhythmic sound of his breathing. Steady, calm. He wasn't afraid. Why wasn't he afraid? She slowly, carefully slid down the wall opposite him, putting as much distance between them as the small room allowed. She had her gun, but what good was it in the pitch black? She couldn't risk a shot that might miss him and ricochet off the stone walls. For now, all she had were her wits. She unfolded the piece of paper James had given her. It was useless in the dark, but she clutched it like a holy relic. A map, a key, hope. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and his steady, calm presence in the corner. The silence was a weapon, designed to break her spirit, to make her scream and beg and pound on the door. She wouldn't give Mrs. Whitmore the satisfaction. She had to think. James had said the walls were hollow, that Mrs. Whitmore used them to listen. Was she listening now? Clara began to tap her fingers against the stone wall beside her, a soft, random pattern. She was testing a theory. She tapped for a full minute, then stopped. She listened, holding her breath, and she heard it. From the other side of the wall, a faint, muffled tapping in response. Not a code, just a sound. Someone was there, confirming her location, reporting back. The house wasn't just a building, it was a living organism, and Mrs. Whitmore was its central nervous system. Clara's blood ran cold. This was worse than she could have ever imagined. Then the man in the corner moved. The chains scraped loudly, and she heard him shift his weight. He was getting up. She scrambled backwards, her hand flying to her gun. "Stay back," she hissed into the darkness. He stopped. The room fell silent again. Then he did something unexpected. He tapped the stone floor with his knuckles. 2 quick taps. A pause, then one more. Tap, tap. Pause, tap. It was a signal. But what did it mean? He repeated it, patiently. Tap, tap. Pause, tap. Clara's mind raced. What was he trying to say? It wasn't Morse code, it was simpler. A question? A statement? She thought back to her childhood on the frontier, the games she played with her brother. Simple codes. What if it wasn't about the number of taps, but the sound? He was tapping on the stone floor. What was under the floor? The cellar. James had mentioned a way out through the cellar. Clara crawled forward slowly, feeling her way across the floor until her hand touched the cold stone near the center of the room. She tapped it with her own knuckles. It sounded solid. She moved a few feet to the left and tapped again. Solid. She moved to the right. Thump. The sound was different. Hollow. There was a space beneath them. She looked toward the corner where he sat. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence, his focused attention. He had just told her, without a single word, that their escape was not through the walls, but through the floor. He had been planning, waiting, for years maybe, waiting for an opportunity, for an ally. And he had chosen her. A new sound broke the silence, a metallic scraping sound coming from the door. Clara froze. A small sliver of light appeared at the bottom of the door as a tray was pushed into the room. On it was a single plate of food and a cup of water. The peephole slid open. Mrs. Whitmore's voice, syrupy sweet, drifted into the cell. "Just a little something to keep your strength up, Miss Morrison. Your companion doesn't get any, I'm afraid. Savages don't appreciate fine cooking. Eat up, dear. We'll talk in the morning." The peephole slammed shut. The smell of the food filled the small room. It was the same rich beef stew she'd eaten earlier. Her stomach growled, a traitorous beast. She was starving, but James's warning echoed in her head. She uses drugs. In the food. The water. This wasn't a meal. It was a weapon. The Apache made a low sound in his throat. Not a word, but a growl of warning. "Don't touch it." Clara pushed the tray away with her foot. The battle for her survival had begun, and the first test was one of will. She would not be broken. Not by hunger, not by thirst, not by fear. She crawled back to the hollow spot in the floor. She needed a tool, something to pry with. Her knife was in her saddlebags. Her gun was useless. She searched her pockets. A hairpin. A few coins. Nothing. Then she remembered. The buckle on her belt. It was heavy, made of steel. She unfastened it. It was clumsy, but it might just work. She began to scrape at the mortar between the flagstones, her fingers raw, her muscles aching. For hours she worked in the suffocating darkness, guided only by touch. The Apache remained silent in his corner, a pillar of patience. His presence was a comfort now, not a threat. They were a team, a silent, desperate team. Finally, she felt a stone give. Just a little. She worked the buckle underneath it, putting all her weight into it, levering it up. The stone was heavy, but it moved. With a final agonizing effort, she lifted it free. A rush of cool, damp air filled the cell, smelling of earth and old wine. They had a way out, but as Clara peered into the blackness below, she heard footsteps in the hall. They were coming back, and they were coming much, much sooner than morning. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful. More than one person. They stopped right outside their door. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to replace the heavy flagstone, but it was too late. There wasn't enough time. The Apache moved with a speed that was terrifying. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, the chain whispering behind him. He grabbed Clara and pulled her back into the corner with him, pressing them both deep into the shadows just as the heavy bolt on the door was thrown back. The door creaked open. A lantern flooded the small room with blinding yellow light. 2 large, rough-looking men stood in the doorway. Farm hands, by the look of them. They held thick clubs in their hands and had pistols tucked into their belts. Behind them, obscured by the light, stood Mrs. Whitmore. "Well, well," she said, her voice sharp and angry. "It seems our guest has refused her dinner and has been redecorating. How very disappointing." The 2 men stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the darkness, trying to locate them. They saw the displaced stone, the dark hole leading to the cellar. "Get them!" Mrs. Whitmore commanded. Clara's hand was on her gun, but the Apache put a hand on her arm, a silent command. "Not yet." The first man advanced, holding his club ready. "Come on out, little lady. The missus just wants to talk." The Apache tensed beside her, a coiled spring of muscle and rage. Clara could feel the heat radiating off him. He was ready to explode. Just as the man got close, the Apache moved. He didn't attack the man directly. Instead, he kicked out with his shackled foot, a powerful, sweeping motion. He wasn't aiming for the man. He was aiming for the lantern. His foot connected with a crash of glass and metal. The lantern flew from the man's hand, hit the far wall, and shattered. The room was plunged back into absolute darkness. The men yelled in surprise and pain. One of them had been splashed with burning oil. In the confusion, the Apache acted. He surged forward, a shadow in the shadows. Clara heard a sickening crunch, a gasp, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. He had taken one of them down. "Shoot them!" Mrs. Whitmore shrieked from the hallway. "Shoot them both!" A gun flashed in the darkness, the muzzle blast momentarily illuminating the chaotic scene. The bullet whizzed past Clara's head and slammed into the stone wall. This was it. It was now or never. "The cellar!" Clara yelled. She scrambled toward the hole in the floor, her only thought to escape the kill box of the tiny room. She dropped through the opening, landing hard on a packed earth floor 10 feet below. The fall knocked the wind out of her, but she was alive. Above her, she heard the sounds of a brutal fight. The Apache was a force of nature, a cornered animal fighting with the last of his strength. The remaining farmhand was screaming, a sound of pure terror that was cut short with another wet, final-sounding thud. Then silence. "Come back up here, Miss Morrison," Mrs. Whitmore's voice called down, dangerously calm. "Come up or I will kill him. I will put a bullet in his head right now." Clara looked up at the square of faint light from the open cell door. She could hear the Apache's ragged breathing. He was alive, but he was still chained, still trapped. "Don't listen to her," his voice came from the darkness above. It was the first time she had heard him speak. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, but filled with an iron certainty. "Go! Run!" A gunshot exploded from above. Clara screamed. A moment of terrible silence followed. Had she killed him? Had this all been for nothing? Then Mrs. Whitmore's voice again, tight with rage. "He moved! The next one won't miss. You have 5 seconds to show yourself, Miss Morrison. 5, 4." Clara was trapped. If she ran, he would die. If she went back, they would both be captured, and whatever came next would be worse than death. 3. She looked around the dark cellar. Wine racks lined the walls. Old furniture was draped in white sheets like rows of ghosts, and in the far corner, something glinted in the faint light from above. A discarded axe leaning against a woodpile. 2. She had no choice. She took a deep breath, drew her Colt, and stepped back into the square of light, her hands raised. "All right," she called up, her voice shaking. "I'm coming back." As she started to look for a way to climb up, Mrs. Whitmore laughed. A cold, triumphant sound. "I knew you had a conscience," she said. "It's always the conscience that is the easiest chain to pull." Clara didn't answer. She let the old woman think she had won. But as she moved into the light, she angled her body, trying to hide the axe she had seen from the view of those above. Her mind was racing. Mrs. Whitmore had made a mistake. She had threatened the one thing in this house that still had a soul. And for that mistake, Clara was going to make her pay. She just had to get back into that room. And this time, she was coming back with a weapon of her own. Clara's surrender was a performance. She kept her hands high, her face a mask of fear and defeat. "Don't shoot him," she called out again, her voice trembling just enough. "I'll do whatever you want." "Wise girl," Mrs. Whitmore's voice floated down, dripping with smug satisfaction. "Now stay right where you are. We'll be down to collect you." Clara heard her giving orders in the hallway above. The trap was closing, but as soon as Mrs. Whitmore's attention was diverted, Clara moved. She dove out of the square of light and scrambled through the darkness toward the woodpile. Her hands closed around the handle of the axe. It was heavy, a wood-splitting axe, its blade dull but serviceable. It felt good in her hands, solid, real. A rope ladder snaked down through the opening. The surviving farm hand, or perhaps a new one, started to climb down, a lantern in one hand, a pistol in the other. He was moving cautiously, his eyes scanning the cellar. Clara pressed herself into the shadows behind a stack of old barrels, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The axe was heavy. Could she even swing it effectively? The man reached the bottom of the ladder. He held the lantern high, its light cutting through the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. "Come on out, little lady," he called, his voice nervous. "Let's not make this any harder than it has to be." His light swept across the cellar, past the wine racks, over the shrouded furniture. It was getting closer. Clara held her breath. The light passed over her hiding spot, lingered for a second, and then moved on. He hadn't seen her. From above, Mrs. Whitmore grew impatient. "What is taking so long, you fool? Find her!" The man started to walk forward, deeper into the cellar, away from the rope ladder, away from his only escape route. It was a fatal mistake. As soon as his back was turned, Clara moved. She ran from her hiding spot, not toward the man, but toward the rope ladder. She had no intention of fighting him down here in the dark. Her goal was the room above. Her goal was the Apache. She was halfway to the ladder when the man heard her. He spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. He raised his pistol to fire. At that exact moment, a length of heavy chain snaked down from the hole in the ceiling. It whipped through the air like a striking serpent and wrapped around the man's gun hand. With a powerful jerk, the Apache ripped the pistol from the man's grasp. The gun flew up into the darkness of the cell above. The man stared at his empty hand in disbelief, then up at the hole where his weapon had vanished. That second of hesitation was all Clara needed. She reached the ladder and scrambled up, the axe banging against her back. She pulled herself into the cell just as the Apache was scooping the pistol off the floor. He looked at the weapon, then at Clara, then at the axe in her hand. A flicker of something that might have been respect showed in his dark eyes. He handed her the pistol. "You fight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "So do you," she said, handing him the axe. "Now let's get those chains off you." The shackles on his wrists and ankles were thick, but the axe was heavy. He placed his wrist on the one remaining intact crate in the room. "Now," he grunted. Clara hesitated for only a second. She raised the heavy axe, aimed carefully at the chain link connecting the two wrist shackles, and brought it down with all her might. Sparks flew. The sound of metal on metal rang through the house. The link was dented, but it held. "Again," he commanded. She swung again, and again. On the fourth strike, the link snapped. His hands were free. He flexed his powerful fingers, then immediately placed his ankle on the crate. A few more brutal swings and the leg irons fell away. He stood up, truly free for the first time in months. He was a terrifying and magnificent sight. A giant of a man, armed with an axe, his eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. Down in the cellar, the farmhand was screaming for help, trying to climb the rope ladder. The Apache walked to the edge of the hole, looked down, and with one swift kick, sent the ladder tumbling back into the cellar. The man's screams were cut off as he fell. They were sealed in the room again, but this time they were armed. And one of them was an engine of pure righteous fury. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. Shouts echoed through the house. The entire hive had been stirred. "They're coming," Clara said, checking the chambers of the pistol. 4 shots left. The Apache didn't answer. He was looking at the door, his knuckles white on the handle of the axe, his body a taut line of anticipation. He wasn't waiting for a fight. He was hunting. The sliding peephole on the door slid open. Mrs. Whitmore's eye appeared, wide with shock and fury at the sight of the freed warrior. "You fools!" she shrieked at someone in the hall. "You let him get free." The Apache smiled. It was a terrifying sight, all teeth and promises of pain. He took a step back, raised the axe, and with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, he swung it at the door. The heavy wood splintered. He swung again, and a huge chunk of the door flew into the hallway. He was not trying to break the lock. He was trying to tear the entire door from its hinges. Through the hole, Clara could see at least 3 more farmhands in the hallway, armed with rifles. They were trying to aim, but they were panicking, tripping over each other in the narrow space. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a reckoning. Another swing, and the lock mechanism shattered. The Apache kicked the ruined door, and it flew open, slamming against the wall. He charged into the hallway, a whirlwind of muscle and steel. The farmhands were no match for him. The first man tried to raise his rifle, but the axe came down, not on the man, but on the gun itself, shearing the wooden stock in 2. The Apache followed through with a punch that sent the man flying. Clara stepped into the doorway, pistol raised. A second man was aiming at the Apache's back. She fired, hitting the man in the shoulder. He screamed and dropped his rifle. It was chaos. A brutal, desperate ballet of violence in the dim, flickering lamplight. And then she saw Mrs. Whitmore. The old woman was standing at the far end of the hall, near the main staircase. But she wasn't running. She wasn't screaming. She was holding something. A small, struggling figure. It was Anna, the young serving girl. Mrs. Whitmore had a knife to the girl's throat. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Stop, or the girl dies! I swear to God, I will cut her throat right here." Everyone froze. The Apache, who was about to bring his axe down on the last conscious farmhand, stopped mid-swing. Clara held her pistol steady, but there was no clear shot. Anna was crying, her face white with terror. "Drop the weapons," Mrs. Whitmore commanded, her eyes wild. "Drop them now!" The Apache looked at Clara. His face was a mask of fury, but she saw the question in his eyes. What do we do? They had come so far, fought so hard. But the monster at the heart of this house had one last trick, one last innocent life to use as a shield. "I said drop them!" Mrs. Whitmore shrieked, pressing the knife harder against Anna's skin. A thin line of red appeared on the girl's throat. Clara's mind raced. There was no way out of this. If they surrendered, they were dead. If they didn't, Anna was dead. But then she saw it, something Mrs. Whitmore, in her panic, had overlooked. Behind her, at the top of the main staircase, a figure had appeared. It was James Henley, and he was holding a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the kitchen. His face was a mixture of terror and resolve. He had finally decided to fight back. Clara needed to create a distraction, a big one. "All right," she shouted, making her voice sound panicked. "We're dropping them. Don't hurt her." She made a show of lowering her pistol. The Apache, seeing her cue, slowly lowered the bloody axe. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes were fixed on them, a triumphant, crazed glint in her stare. She didn't see James creeping down the stairs behind her. Clara met James's eyes over the old woman's shoulder. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Now. James raised the skillet high over his head. Mrs. Whitmore must have sensed something at the last second. She started to turn, but it was too late. James brought the iron skillet down with all the force of 2 years of pent-up fear and rage. The sound of it connecting with Mrs. Whitmore's head was a dull, sickening thud. Her eyes rolled back in her head. The knife clattered to the floor. She collapsed in a heap of black silk, unconscious. Anna stumbled forward, gasping and sobbing, into Clara's arms. James Henley stood over the fallen matriarch, the skillet still in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked at Clara, then at the Apache, then at the carnage in the hallway. "It's over," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe it. Is it really over?" The Apache walked over to the unconscious form of Mrs. Whitmore. He nudged her with his foot, then looked up at them. "Now," he said, his voice a low growl, "the real justice begins." The house fell into a stunned, surreal silence. The fight was over, but the war for their souls had just begun. Theodore and Robert emerged from the dining room, drawn by the sudden quiet. They stared at the unconscious form of their captor, their faces a cocktail of disbelief, terror, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. "She's," Theodore started, unable to finish the sentence. "She's not dead," Clara said, checking Mrs. Whitmore's pulse. "But she won't be bothering anyone for a while." She looked at the Apache, his name. She still didn't know his name. "We need to tie her up. The chains you were wearing, where are they?" "In the room," he grunted. They dragged the woman back into the very cell where she had locked them and used her own chains to bind her hands and feet. When she woke up, she would wake up a prisoner, just like she had made so many others. Anna, her tears finally slowing, found her voice. "The others," she whispered. "The other girls, Mary and Sarah. They're locked in the kitchen pantry. She always locks them in when there's trouble." James, seeming to grow in stature with every passing moment of freedom, took charge. "I'll get them. Robert, come with me. We need to check the rest of the house. See if there are any more of her men hiding." Robert, who had looked like a frightened boy moments before, straightened his shoulders. The doctor he was meant to be flickered in his eyes. "Right. Let's go." As they left, Theodore sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, so profound they were painful. Clara knelt beside him. "It's all right, Theodore. You're safe now." "Safe?" he choked out. "I don't even remember what that feels like. My wife, my children, do they even remember me? She made us write letters. Letters saying we'd run away, that we were never coming back. She has them. Proof. To ruin us if we ever escaped." "We'll find them," Clara said fiercely. "We'll find everything." She looked at the Apache warrior, who was standing guard at the door of the cell, the bloody axe still resting on his shoulder. "What is your name?" she asked him quietly. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "They call me many things," he said, his voice low. "My people call me Ayana. It means blossom." The name was so at odds with his appearance, so gentle for such a fierce man, that Clara almost smiled. "Ayana," she repeated. "I'm Clara." "I know," he said. A wave of exhaustion washed over Clara. The adrenaline that had fueled her for hours was gone, leaving behind an aching emptiness. They had won. But what came next? The house was a prison, the men were broken, and the architect of their misery was chained in the next room. Robert and James returned with the 2 other serving girls, who looked pale and terrified but unharmed. "The house is clear," James announced. "Her men must have run for it after we took her down." He looked at Theodore, then at Robert, a new grim reality dawning on his face. "But she was right about one thing. The drugs. I can already feel it. The shaking, the cold sweat. We need it. God help me, we need it." Robert nodded, his own hands trembling slightly. "Her study. She keeps all her medicines there. The journals, the formulas. If we can find them, maybe I can figure out what she was giving us. Maybe I can figure out how to wean us off it without dying." "Her study is on the 2nd floor, east wing," James said, pulling the tattered map from his pocket. "Here, It's marked. Ayana and I will go, Clara said. The rest of you lock the front door. Barricade it. Don't let anyone in or out until we get back. And find some food. Real food. Not the poisoned stuff she serves. Clara and Ayana moved through the silent house. It felt different now. The menace was gone, replaced by a sad, empty feeling. It was just a house filled with ghosts and pain. They found the study easily. It was locked, but Ayana's axe made short work of the door. Inside, the room was a testament to organized evil. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A massive desk sat in the center, and shelves were filled with hundreds of medical bottles, each neatly labeled with chemical formulas and strange codes. Clara went straight for the desk. The drawers were locked. She used the butt of her pistol to smash them open. Inside, she found what Theodore had feared. Bundles of letters, tied with ribbon, confessions, farewells, all in the handwriting of the men downstairs. But there was something else. Photographs, dozens of them, all of women, young women, old women, all with the same haunted, terrified look in their eyes. On the back of each one was a name, a date, and a single chilling word. Disposed. The women from the garden, Clara whispered, her stomach turning. She kept souvenirs. Ayana, meanwhile, was examining a large ornate portrait that hung on the wall behind the desk. It was the painting of the young woman in the wedding dress, Catherine Whitmore. He ran his hand along the frame, then pressed a spot on the bottom. With a soft click, the painting swung away from the wall, revealing a hidden safe. She loved her secrets, Ayana rumbled. The safe was a simple combination lock. They had no way of knowing the numbers. We'll have to break it open, Clara said. But Robert, who had followed them upstairs, shook his head. He was holding a small leather-bound journal he'd found on a bookshelf. I don't think we'll have to, he said, his voice trembling with disgust. This is her private journal. It's all in here. Her experiments. Her philosophy. He opened the book and read aloud. Subject TB shows signs of complete dissolution. Memory of family is fading. Attachment to the control substance is absolute. A successful conversion? He swallowed hard. That's Theodore. He flipped a few pages. My Catherine. My foolish, sentimental Catherine. She discovered my work today. She called it monstrous. She threatened to expose me. She does not understand the importance of my research into the breaking of the human will. She has left me no choice. I have made arrangements for her to be taken to the sanatorium in Topeka. They understand how to deal with hysterical females. The combination to my future will be the day I save my work from her. March 15th, 1869. The room was silent. The story was even darker than they had imagined. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't just lost her daughter. She had sacrificed her. Clara walked to the safe. Her fingers trembled as she turned the dial. 3, 15, 69. The handle turned. The heavy door swung open. Inside were more journals, stacks of money, and dozens of small vials filled with the concentrated drugs she used to control her prisoners. It was the arsenal of a monster. We have it, Robert said, his voice filled with a fragile hope. We have everything we need to prove what she did, and I have what I need to try and fix it. They had won. They had uncovered the secrets, found the proof, and locked the monster in her own cage. But as Clara looked at the faces of Robert and the other men, at the deep, invisible scars this house had carved into their souls, she knew that for the survivors of Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house, the real storm was just beginning. Escaping the house was one thing. Escaping what the house had done to them would be a different battle entirely. As the sun began to rise, a fragile peace settled over the house. Robert worked like a man possessed, poring over Mrs. Whitmore's journals in the study, trying to decipher her twisted science. The rest of them gathered in the dining room, the scene of their first terrifying encounter, and shared a meal of bread and dried meat from the pantry, the first untainted food the prisoners had eaten in years. It was a strange, somber feast. Theodore still wept silently. James stared into space, as if trying to recall the face of the man he used to be. The serving girls huddled together, speaking in whispers. Only Ayana seemed at peace. He stood by the window, watching the storm clouds break apart on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "We need to get help," Clara said, breaking the silence. "As soon as the roads are clear, I'll ride into town. I'll bring back the marshal." "And then what?" James asked, his voice hollow. "They'll take her away, but what about us? Look at me. I'm a shaking wreck. Theodore can't even speak. What life is waiting for us out there?" "A free one," Ayanna said, without turning from the window. "It is enough to begin." His simple words seemed to hang in the air, filled with a power that cut through their despair. He had endured more than any of them, and he was not broken. His strength was a silent challenge to them all. Clara spent the next few hours helping Anna and the other girls search the house. They uncovered the full, horrifying scope of Mrs. Whitmore's operation. They found a hidden room in the attic, filled with the personal belongings of the women in the photographs: dresses, letters, dolls, wedding rings. A museum of stolen lives. In the cellar, they found scratch marks on the walls of a locked storage room, names and dates, final messages from women who had been left to starve in the dark. Every discovery was another layer of hell. But with every secret they dragged into the light, the house seemed to lose a little more of its power. The shadows receded. The air grew lighter. It was as if the building itself could finally breathe again. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside was washed clean. "It's time," Clara said. She saddled Buttercup, her movements crisp and efficient. In her saddlebags, she packed Mrs. Whitmore's most damning journals and the letters of confession. The group gathered on the porch to see her off. They looked like a band of shipwrecked survivors, battered and bruised but alive. Robert gave her a list of medical supplies he needed. James pressed a roll of money into her hand, money they'd found in the safe. "For your trouble," he said. Theodore finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She turned to Ayanna. "Will you be here when I get back?" He looked out at the vast open prairie, a landscape that was once his home. "My fight is done here," he said. "A new one waits." He planned to travel north, to find what was left of his people. He held out his hand. "Clara Morrison, you have the heart of a warrior." She shook it. "You too, Ayanna Blossom." A small smile touched his lips. Clara mounted Buttercup and didn't look back. She rode hard, the hope of a dozen broken souls riding with her. The marshal in the nearest town, a grizzled veteran named Hutcherson, listened to her story with a look of stone-faced disbelief that slowly morphed into cold fury. The journals she provided were undeniable proof. Within an hour, he had deputized a posse of 10 men. The ride back to the house was a grim, silent affair. When they arrived, the scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and beautiful. In the garden, Ayanna, James, and Theodore were working together. They had dug new graves, proper graves, for the women Mrs. Whitmore had murdered. They were building simple wooden crosses for each one. They couldn't give them back their names, not yet, but they could give them dignity. They could give them remembrance. The curse of the house was being broken, not by violence, but by an act of profound and defiant decency. Marshal Hutcherson took one look at the rows of makeshift graves and removed his hat. "God have mercy," he breathed. They brought Mrs. Whitmore up from the cellar. She was no longer the composed, powerful matriarch. Her hair was a mess, her dress was torn, and her eyes were filled with a venomous, impotent rage. When she saw the marshal, she tried to reclaim her authority. "Marshal Hutcherson," she snapped, "arrest these people. They have assaulted me and taken over my home." The marshal just looked at her, then at the garden, then back at her. He didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the wagon. His meaning was clear. Her reign was over. As his deputies led her away in her own chains, she screamed at Clara. "You think you've won? You've ruined everything. They are nothing without me. They will fall apart. They are weak." Clara just watched her go. She looked over at the men she had freed. James was standing straighter. Theodore was helping Ayanna carve a name into a cross. Catherine, the daughter who had tried to stop the madness. Robert was directing the new doctor from town, explaining the treatments he had devised. They were not weak, they were survivors, and their healing had already begun. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings and painful discoveries. Mrs. Whitmore's network of contacts was exposed, leading to scandals that rocked Kansas society. The bodies in the garden were identified, and families from all over the country finally learned the fate of their missing daughters, sisters, and wives. The house, once a place of horror, was transformed. Anna and the other girls decided to stay, to turn it into what it was always supposed to be, a true sanctuary for weary travelers. Clara stayed long enough to see the change begin. She watched as James reconnected with his family, as Theodore began to talk about a future, as Robert was offered a place at a medical school in St. Louis. One morning she knew it was time to leave. Her aunt was still waiting in Dodge City. Her own life was waiting. She found Ayanna sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunrise. He was leaving that day too. "Will you be all right?" she asked him. "Freedom is a heavy blanket after a lifetime of cold," he said, "but I will learn to wear it." He stood and faced her. "What will you do now, Clara the warrior?" "Just keep riding, I suppose," she said with a smile, "and try to stay out of trouble." He grunted, a sound that was almost a laugh. "Trouble has a way of finding those with hearts like yours." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two survivors of a storm that had almost consumed them. Clara finally got back on the trail, her horse's hooves eating up the miles toward Dodge City. The prairie didn't seem so empty anymore. She knew now that it was filled with stories. Stories of hardship and sorrow, but also stories of incredible strength and the fierce, unyielding power of the human spirit to fight its way back into the light. She had arrived at the house seeking shelter from a storm, and had found herself in the heart of a hurricane. She had faced down a monster, freed the captives, and uncovered a darkness she never knew existed. But she had also found courage she never knew she possessed. And she had learned that sometimes the only way to survive the storm is to become the storm yourself. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice on the frontier, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And let me know in the comments below. What would you have done if you were faced with Mrs. Whitmore's choice? Thanks for listening. And until next time, watch out for those storms you can't see coming.